Most of us, myself included, have seen the launch reviews of the RTX 5080 graphics cards by now. If you haven't, then this noise sums up my feelings quite nicely. With that being said though, I'm a gamer at heart, just like a lot of you no doubt are. That coupled with me using my PC for work means I'm always on the lookout for an upgrade that'll either make my life easier or more fun. So when PC Specialist sent over their Cortex Pro desktop for review, I wanted to know if it's worth dropping some pretty serious money on a new system. How much of a difference would I see jumping to the Cortex Pro from my PC, which doesn't have a fancy name? Let the battle commence. Hi guys, I'm Matt and welcome to Kit Guru. So I'm heading into this review of the Cortex Pro from PC Specialist, looking to answer the upgrade question that I asked a second ago. I, like many of you, I guess, I was looking forward to the release of the 5080, but I was left a bit deflated after the initial reviews. That might be putting it lightly. If you want to know more about either the GPU or the CPU, then Dominic and Leo have both been through everything in a lot of detail in previous videos. Moving on then, the main specs of my current PC are a 7800X3D CPU, a 7900X TX GPU, an AMD GPU, and then it's 32 gigs of 6000 megatransfers DDR5 memory. So I'm a generation behind on the CPU, and I'm running the latest and greatest for now in terms of graphics card. So let's put it to the test against the Cortex Pro from PC Specialist. Picking up this specific machine from them will set you back a tasty £2,699, which will bag you the following specs. A Ryzen 7 9800X 3D CPU, arguably the best gaming CPU you can buy. It's got 8 cores, 16 threads, it's got 3D V-cache as the name suggests, and it runs on a TDP of 120 watts. It's a beast. The cores max out at 5.2 GHz on paper and run at a base clock speed of 4.7 GHz. The graphics card is undoubtedly the star of both the spec and the price list. It's the ASUS TUF RTX 5080 OC edition. Now, love them or hate them, the 5000 series cards are here to stay. If you can get your hands on one at the moment, that is. To be honest, buying a new pre-built could be an easier way to get your hands on one rather than trying to beat stock issues or scalpers. The 5080 comes with all of Nvidia's new bells and whistles like DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation, which we'll put to the test a little bit later on. It's rocking 16 gig of memory running across a 256-bit bus. GPU-Z reports the base clock speed at 2295 MHz with a boost clock speed of 2700 MHz. Now, in terms of design, I really like how this card looks. I've been a fan of the kind of rugged design of the TUF line of products from ASUS for quite some time now. I really like their kind of industrial looks, and that's no exception with this graphics card. For memory, we have 32 gig of Corsair Vengeance RGB running at 6000 megatransfers. That's pretty much the sweet spot in terms of both speed and capacity for a gaming system in 2025. The CL timing on this memory is 36 though, which is not the greatest, and it would have been nice to see CL30 timings, but in reality, it shouldn't make a massive difference to performance. For storage, we have a 2TB drive, hallelujah, enough of the stingy 1TB drives we've seen in most of the pre-builts I've looked at in the past. This time around, we've got a 2TB Samsung 990 Pro. It's more than fast enough and it's got ample storage to handle all 10 of the games I installed for testing. Game install sizes are getting ridiculous. Testing the 990 Pro with Crystal Disk Mark resulted in read speeds of almost 7,400 megabytes per second and write speeds of just a hair over 6,500 megabytes per second. All of those components are sitting in an ASUS TUF B850 Plus Wi-Fi motherboard. It continues with that TUF styling and matches the GPU, which is nice to see. And this board features great network connectivity with Wi-Fi 7 and a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port on board. There's plenty of I/O with 9 Type A USB ports and 1 Type C at the rear, alongside the standard audio and video ports. It's got 3 M.2 slots in total, one of which supports Gen 5, and all of which have included heatsinks, which match the pretty beefy VRM and PCH cooling heatsinks on this motherboard. All in all, I like this board. As I mentioned earlier, I kind of prefer tough products. I think personally that they're the nicest products that ASUS make, design-wise. And the design of this board in particular suits this system well. And while it's not the top-end X870 chipset, it still has all of the specs that most people will need in a gaming machine. Powering everything is a Corsair 1000W RMX PSU. That's a fully modular unit that's got 80 plus gold rating, and it's from a decent brand. It should be more than enough to keep this system running and keep the components, specifically the GPU, fed with enough stable power. Keeping that 9800X 3D CPU cool is a PC Specialist FrostFlow 360mm ARGB AIO cooler, a model that we've seen in previous PC Specialist pre-builts, and it has performed well in the past. The radiator has been mounted in the roof of this system, with the fans set to push air across the cooling fins. It should easily be enough to keep the processor cool through anything you throw at it. Handling airflow through the case are 4 120mm PC Specialist case fans. You've got 3 on the front/side section, bringing air into the case, and then 1 in the rear, exhausting hot air out of the back. And speaking of that case, housing all of that stuff we just went through is a PC Specialist LUMIN ARGB mid-tower case in black, the same case that was used in the Helio Ultra I looked at a while back, and it's a rebrand of the Gamdias Niso P1. One cool thing about this case that I like is that you can either stand it up in a traditional manner, or you can swap the feet over and you can lie it down horizontally, giving easy access to the internals, and I think it looks pretty cool too. Front I/O consists of 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports, a single USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port, and then an audio jack. The LUMIN is capable of housing 10 120mm fans or 6 140mm fans in total. There's space for some additions in the bottom if you want to expand the cooling a little bit more in the future. Checking over the build, I didn't find anything out of place. Cable management has been done to a pretty good standard, which has always been the case on every PC Specialist system that I've looked at. And I like how this system looks. As I mentioned a little bit ago, the tough GPU and motherboard obviously complement each other quite nicely, and they complement that black theme, which is far and away from my own system. And black PCs I went through a white phase, but blacked out systems are growing on me each time I review a stealthy looking system like this. If I have to pick one thing that I'm not a fan of, then it'd have to be the pump cap on the cooler. I'd prefer a cleaner design over that PC Specialist branding. I don't hate it, but I just think it would look better with something a bit more neutral. Right, enough chat about specs then. Let's get back to the burning question. How much better than a relatively recent system, my system, is this? We'll leave the few charts that I've got for the end of the video, and we're going to dive straight into gaming. Starting at 1440p in Counter-Strike 2 then, with everything absolutely maxed out, the Cortex Pro feels a bit overkill for this sort of game, but it's something I occasionally play, so I thought it deserved a bit of a test. FPS was more than double my monitor's refresh rate, starting off at around 400 and dropping slightly to roughly 350. My PC saw that performance drop a bit as I expected going into these tests, but it still managed to put out performance that was north of 250 FPS. Moving into some Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p and putting much more demand on both the CPU and the GPU, the Cortex Pro managed to put out FPS of around the 130 to 150 mark, with occasional peaks pushing almost 160 frames. The 7900 XTX and 7800 X3D in my machine put up quite a fight in this title. Performance wasn't too far away from the Cortex Pro, roughly around 10 to 20 FPS lower most of the time, with the frame times being around 1 millisecond slower. The last title we're going to look at 1440p then is Sniper Elite Resistance. This is a pretty new title, which admittedly I haven't played much of, but I wanted to test. So I jumped into the practice range and clocked the Cortex Pro, putting out roughly 170 FPS, with a similar frame time to what we saw in Hogwarts Legacy at around 6 milliseconds. It's a similar comparison on my system too. Performance was around 10 FPS lower, with very similar frame times. Raster performance at 1440p seems very close in these newer titles, as we saw in Dom's review of the 5080 when it released last week or the week before, whenever it was. The 7900 XTX is putting up a good fight. Let's move on to 4K raster performance. Starting with Forza Horizon 5 at 4K max settings with no ray tracing or scaling at all then, and the Cortex Pro performance was measured at around 130 FPS through the game's built-in benchmark. I say it all the time in my reviews, but the graphics in Forza just wow me every time I boot it up. It's a gorgeous game. It does look as nice on my current system, but this is where we start to see the gap in performance between the two systems appear, with FPS readings hovering around the 80 to 90 area, roughly 40-ish lower than the Cortex Pro, with a slight increase to frame times 2. It's still a way more than playable experience though, and the game still looks and feels great. Moving into A Plague Tale Requiem then, and this sees the demand on the systems ramp up quite significantly. At 4K max settings on the Cortex Pro, without any of the Nvidia witchcraft turned on, we see performance of around 60 to 70 FPS, with frame times recorded at roughly 15 milliseconds. Now this is one title where it's absolutely worth cranking the graphics up and playing at a locked 60 FPS in my opinion. The scenery is maybe the best I've seen in any game, it's definitely up there. My system didn't manage to quite hit 60 FPS with the same maximum settings, which would make me start tinkering with settings if I was about to get stuck into a gaming session. I want to see 60 FPS at all times in a game like this, which the Cortex Pro managed. Frame times were also very slightly higher on my machine, coming in at around 18 milliseconds. The final title tested without any scaling or ray tracing is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. I've played a little bit of this game since it released and it's very, very good. An early game of the year contender in my opinion. Performance on the Cortex Pro was around 85 to 95 FPS with frame times of around 12 milliseconds. It felt great during this little intro sort of tutorial sequence. My system did manage to maintain 60 plus FPS too, which was great to see. Now I personally play on an ultra-wide monitor at 5120 by 1440, so 4K isn't a resolution that I usually play at. If any of you are interested in ultra-wide testing in future reviews, then let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do and add some of that stuff in for you in the future. Finally, let's look at performance with DLSS on the Cortex Pro or FSR on my machine, as well as frame gen on both of them turned on, or multi-frame gen in the instance of Cyberpunk on the Cortex Pro. That RTX 5080 found in the Cortex Pro really flexes its technological muscles in this title. This is the game with every single setting on maximum, including ray tracing set to the highest it'll go, and it's still managed 130 to 140 FPS with that MFG turned on. Latency does increase when turning frame generation on, but not to any sort of level where it's going to be causing any sort of problems. It's still a very, very playable experience. If you want more in-depth analysis on that latency, then I highly suggest going and watching Dominic's review of the 5090 where he went through everything in detail. The Nvidia advantage is plain to see when we switch over to my AMD-based machine. Performance was roughly half with ray tracing set to the medium preset, with FSR and frame gen again turned on. Performance with ray tracing set to maximum was in the single digits. Nvidia are the ray tracing kings, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And the gap has only widened with the addition of DLSS 4 and that multi-frame generation. The last title in the lineup is Hellblade 2, which I'll admit I haven't played at all aside from my testing, but I was blown away by how good this game looks. The Cortex Pro managed performance of around 140 FPS with frame times of around 7 milliseconds. This dwarfed my machine, with the 7800X3D and 7900XTX managing around half that at 70-ish FPS. It's also worth noting that GPU power draw throughout all of these tests was higher on my AMD card. The RTX 5080 performs better and is more efficient, but it also costs a fair bit more, so swings and roundabouts. So the gaming performance was about in line with what was to be expected based on reviews of the 5080. In rasterized performance, the difference between the two systems wasn't too massive, but as soon as you move into using ray tracing and frame generation, it becomes clear that Nvidia have the upper hand, helped further in this instance by the newer CPU in the Cortex Pro. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to know more about the 5080, then you'll definitely want to check out Dominic's incredibly in-depth review. He goes through everything you could want to know. We'll leave a link in the description if you want to go and watch it. Finally, let's run through a few charts then before I wrap up the video. There's only a few, I'm not going to bore you with billions of them. I tested the systems through a few synthetic benchmarks, and I've purposely placed these after the gameplay as it's easy to look at a chart and make a snap decision without actually stopping to think about how you'd use a system and how it would work in the real world. It's a gaming PC after all, so gaming is the most important thing in my opinion. The Cinebench multi-core results put the Cortex Pro roughly 5,000 points higher than my current system, which on paper is a very decent win for the PC specialist machine. But you don't want to spend £2.6 thousand on a gaming machine to run Cinebench. Single core scores presented a similar result. The 9800X3D scored 2,059 points while using 5 watts less power over the course of a 30-minute test, whereas the 7800X3D came in with 1,771 points. 3D Mark Timespy adds some GPU testing into the mix, albeit a synthetic workload, and as we'd expect, the Cortex comfortably beats my current rig. But do those differences in numbers mean enough to splash the cash on new parts, or in this case, a whole new system? Finally, and in my opinion, the most compelling result is the total system power when measured at the wall socket. The total system efficiency, I suppose. The Cortex Pro performs better and uses substantially less power while doing so. Out of all the different metrics I've looked at, this might be the one that makes me think about upgrades the most. With the price of energy being as crazy it is right now, it's going to pay for itself, right? That's what I'm going to tell my missus anyway. And one last thing, system noise from the Cortex Pro and its 360mm AIO and its 4 case fans hasn't struck me as being anything crazy. It's not a noisy system at all. You can obviously hear it, it's a massive gaming PC, but it's nothing mental. Here's the sound it puts out in its out-of-the-box setup. So flipping to the AC130 camera mode then with a bit of a thermal image of the computer. As I'm sure most of you are aware, there's been some concerning updates regarding the 50 series cards and the power cables not balancing power correctly and connectors melting and stuff like that. So I thought we'd better check it out on this one. As you can see from this shot, the hottest point on the graphics card is kind of the back of the GPU die on the backplate, where there's a bit of an opening in the GPU backplate, and it hits around 57 degrees when we're a bit further away. If we zoom in close to get a bit of a more accurate reading, we can see the hottest point is still the back of the GPU die at around 67 degrees, and you can see the cable and the connector, which is the area of concern, in the bottom right of the frame. This is with Cyberpunk, so in a typical gaming sort of scenario after it's been running about 30 minutes. And then I wanted to stress the graphics card even more, so I ran Furmark for about 10-15 minutes. So this clip sped up to show the heat building up as that Furmark run started, as that Furmark test started. In this first clip, you can see the heat building both on the connector, which is the white crosshair you can see in the middle of the scene, and then the red crosshair is the hot spot or the hottest point in the frame. Skipping to around 10-15 minutes into the Furmark benchmark then, and we can see the GPU's hottest part is still the back of the GPU die, sitting at around 72 to 73 degrees. But more interestingly, the cable and the connector, specifically where it's connecting to the graphics card from the power supply, has settled at around 45 degrees. And the thermal image is not showing any hot spots of anything that would concern me. So as this is a brand new GPU and a brand new cable, in this system specifically, there's nothing to be concerned about. Not saying there isn't a wider issue that's going on for people, because obviously there is, but with this system from PC Specialist, it seems all good. So then, that was a bit of a different system review, a lot less charts and much more gameplay. Hopefully you found it a bit more interesting than my previous system reviews. Let me know in the comments. I went into this video wanting to know if it's worth upgrading from a relatively recent and relatively powerful system to something new and shiny. The Cortex Pro, when looked at a system on its own, is pretty phenomenal. It's got one of the best gaming spec combinations on the market right now, unless you want to sacrifice a kidney and get a 5090. Slight upgrades to the RAM would push it a bit further, but the CPU and the GPU are both going to provide an absolutely stellar gaming experience. It's got the usual attention to detail that we're used to seeing from PC Specialists, and it comes backed by their warranty, so you get peace of mind there. And then there's the operating system license that's thrown in as well. But all of it, no matter what I say, it doesn't come cheap. £2,699 all in. That's a lot of money. If you're looking for a new system or are upgrading and coming from something that's getting a bit dated now, I don't know, like a 3000 series Nvidia card and or maybe a 2nd gen Ryzen, something like that, and you've got the money to spend, then I've no doubt that you'll be happy with that PC sitting behind me. And I've no doubt that you can get stuck into whatever game you want, crank the settings to their maximum, and you'll have a good time. But if you're like me and you have a relatively decent PC, or well, pretty good PC to be fair, I'm being quite humble, and it's quite recent, then it's a hard one to call. It's a lot of money to upgrade to the latest part every year. The performance gains are there, but are they worth it? For me, probably not. But I guess if you're thinking about getting a new system or upgrading your system, only you can answer that question. And that's the end of the video, guys. I hope you liked it. Please leave me a like down below if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to Kit Guru to keep up with the latest PC gaming news and reviews. And if you go down below the video, you'll find links to our merch store. And then in the description, you'll find links to our Discord server, our Patreon page, and our website if you want to check any of that stuff out. Anyway, guys, I've been Matt. That's been the Cortex Pro pre-built desktop from PC Specialist. I'll speak to you in the next one. Look after yourselves. See you later.